All right, well, welcome everybody to another edition of the Beyond Compliance webinar and podcast series. My name is Brian Sharp with Safety Chain Software. Want to thank all of you for making some time in your busy schedules to join us for another really great topic this month. This month we're tackling risk, rethinking risk, how to effectively assess your company's exposure quotient. And one of our favorites, fan favorite, I should say, I always joke with her, she has a big following, Melanie Neumann with Neumann Risk Services, and I'll be giving you a little more background on her and the topic here in just a few minutes. But again, thank you everybody for being with us. And we're gonna dive straight in here. So first and foremost, for those of you that are joining us and have been part of the series since we started it, welcome back. For those of you that are new, just wanted to give you a little context. We've obviously been putting out a lot of really great content over the years, and there's no shortage of webinars or white papers to read. But in talking to our community and our customers, one of the things that we found that was lacking is kind of that tangible, in the trenches type content. And that's what this series is really designed to be, educational webinar and podcast series. It's really about kind of the strategy, the application of these ideas. What are these professionals and thought leaders and experts doing with clients or with their own facilities, real life in the trench type stuff. So the hope here is that we give you really good bite-sized concepts that you can take away, and not just super high level theoretical, but things that are very tactical that you can hopefully put to practice right away in your own facility. So we do these for you, and we welcome your feedback, ideas on topics, even presenters. Those are all really helpful for us, and we'll keep them coming as long as you keep on coming. So we put these on, obviously at no cost, as you can imagine. There's a fair amount of time and effort and resources that go into putting these together. But if anybody charges you to get in, you should definitely ask for your money back. But for those of you that have not heard of us at Safety Chain, we are a food quality management system, kind of handle everything end to end in terms of capturing, managing, and analyzing that data in your facility. So we have specific programs around food safety, food quality, and supplier compliance. So you'll hear Melanie, along with our other guests throughout the series, talk a lot about the strategy and what's happening in the facility from that standpoint. And we're one of the tools that can help make it a little bit easier to actually take some action on some of those ideas. So if you're looking for a way to make it a little faster and easier, more effective, that's what we do. Certainly would love to share more about what we're up to. You can always visit us at our website at safetychain.com. So keep us in mind if we can be of service to you there. Couple of housekeeping things we'll do before we jump into the good stuff here. One is, if you're new, we try and keep a kind of what we like to call an informal but professional format. So we don't take ourselves that seriously, although these topics are very serious, but we try and make these conversational. It's one of the things I always really appreciate about our guests. And so I hope you enjoy that format. And with that, the idea is to be as interactive as we can. So as if we were sitting around having a conversation at a trade show. We certainly want to welcome your questions. One of the challenges in doing webinars, I'm sure many of you, have web meetings all day long, is, you don't have that eyeball to eyeball contact with your audience. So we want to know if we're not getting the right, information to you, or you have some specific questions. It's much easier to gauge, obviously, when we have some engagement. So there's a really easy to use questions box. Open that up, fire them away. You'll notice that only our panelists team here are all listed. So you can just send those straight over to us. Probably the biggest question we always get is that, yes, we are recording, and we will be sharing a link to the recording after we are done. And Melanie has also been kind enough to allow us to share a copy of the slide deck. So if you're like me and you prefer to hang back and have a cup of coffee or hot chocolate, as my colleagues make fun of me, you're welcome to do that, and not have to worry about taking a bunch of notes. But we'll get you both of those within a day or two of the closing of the show here. And last but not least, you'll notice we're on a new webinar system, trying to always improve ourselves, and hoping that we can improve some of the audio things that come along with this. If you do have a challenge, there's still two ways to log in. You can log in via the web on your computer audio, or you can use the call-in number. You just need to go to that audio tab, and you'll have the options to click over back and forth. So If neither of those work, sometimes the automagical way to do it is a log out, log back in, and see if that does the trick. At least that's what my kids always tell me with their stuff. So, all right, let's go ahead and get ready to dig into the good stuff. We're really excited about this topic. Risk is obviously a big part of what all of you are thinking about, keeps you up at night. It's certainly what keeps our presenter very, very busy, talking again about how to effectively assess your company's exposure quotient. And Melanie is someone who's well known in the industry. Many of you have probably seen her speak, maybe participated in some of her sessions at different various industry shows and events, or maybe even worked with her in the consulting facet. But a little background on Melanie is that she's the president of Neumann Risk Services, LLC. She's also the executive vice president of Matrix Sciences. She has over 19 years of industry experience as a food law attorney, helping clients manage the risks relating to each step in the supply chain, from supplier risk management to procurement, manufacturing, distribution, and sale of food globally, including regulatory interaction when issues arise. Melanie is also a graduate of Mitchell Hamline Law School in Minnesota, as well as holds her MS in Food Safety from Michigan State University. She's also an adjunct professor at Michigan State and serves on advisory panels and boards of several notable organizations. She's a frequent speaker on executive liability in food production, as well as FSMA regulations. And with that, I'm very excited to have a very special guest and partner, Melanie Neumann. So Melanie, can you hear me okay?
I sure can, Brian. Thanks so much for your gracious introduction.
Absolutely. So I'm going to go ahead and give you some controls here and let you take over the show here. So you should be all set to go ahead and advance from here on out.
Fantastic. And for those of you in the audience who haven't had an opportunity to meet Brian Sharp yet, as you can tell, he's full of energy. And so, Brian, it might be a good thing you're not a coffee drinker.
I think they came to hear you, so we're in good shape. I'll be quiet, I promise. So.
Absolutely. That said, I think I'm on my third cup of coffee, so I will try not to talk too quickly through the slides here. And let's just see if my controls are working.
You go ahead and click the screen and then go forward. You should be good.
Okay.
There you go.
Excellent. Okay, just a bit of a delay on my end. So I'm learning. Bear with me, folks. And thanks so much for joining us on what I believe is a very important topic about risk management and really kind of looking at risk through a new lens and with a new angle, if you will. And so what are we talking about here with this thing called the exposure quotient? Maybe that's what intrigued you to just join this webinar, is just curiosity with respect to what this is. And let's just start at the very beginning. We've all heard of IQ, otherwise known as the intelligence quotient, right? So in a nutshell, that's a total score that is derived from standardized tests to assess human intelligence. The relative score, that score can flux. It can improve, for example, as our learnings improve. What the exposure quotient is, or what I'll refer to as EQ for short going forward, it's really meant to assess your organizational intelligence. And that is really focusing on the various myriad risks that food safety and quality professionals are typically required to manage on a daily basis. Now, some of you in the audience may kind of feel this pain, if you will, but where I'm going with this and where the assessment goes with these types of risk assessments are that, for example, we get a new regulation. We have the preventive controls rule, if those of you who are listening are FDA regulated. And we have to create a food safety plan by a certain deadline, by a certain date. And sometimes what happens is that it lends us easily to put what I call blinders on. We get so focused on hitting that finish line and that deadline that sometimes we're not maybe as attuned to the other various risks that we're expected to manage every day, that are going on around us every day. And the exposure quotient was really developed and meant to remind us of all those various risks. And where are we on a relative scale of risk to understand perhaps where do we invest our resources? Where do we invest our dollars? Where do we invest our time? Because we all know all of that's limited. So what this exposure quotient is really a combination of assessing human intelligence or IQ and your exposure quotient or your organizational intelligence. So for example, there's questions that we should really be asking about the training of our staff. Do we rise up and meet the definitions of, for example, the PCQI, the Preventive Controlled Qualified Individual? Do the rest of our staff and personnel who are handling and manufacturing food, do they rise up to the level of the definition of a qualified individual? If we're USDA regulated, do we have the appropriate HACCP managers and HACCP training in place? Have we done GMP training? All of this really does, when we break it down, revolve around humans, personnel, the IQ. And then where we shift into the combination approach of looking at more of an organizational intelligence, it's more of your corporate programs, your facility programs. How are we managing risk? How are we managing our supply chain, for example? What and where are our various different risks? And to be able to then understand that we can quantify that. We can put this in numerics. I think a lot of us have realized in the last 12 to 18 months, we are hearing a lot about this phrase, big data. Excuse me. And really having a quantifiable way to assess risk becomes very helpful in this era of big data. Is it required? No. Is it helpful? Absolutely. But again, the overall exposure quotient or risk assessment, it's relative. And again, too, just like IQ, it can improve as our organizations improve and as we learn and as we grow as an organization. And what it's really intended to do is turn data and information into actionable information. That's the net result or the net outcome or objective of going through any kind of organizational risk assessment, and in particular, this exposure quotient. Does this sound complicated? Perhaps my opening explanation of what the heck this is does sound complicated, but it really isn't. What this is a risk assessment. Your organization may already be using some form of a risk assessment, and that's perfectly fine. Where we like to make a recommendation is to really ask yourself, how broad is it? What's the breadth? What's the depth? Are we only looking at certain types of risks? Are we only looking at the topics or the issues that perhaps maybe one of our GFSI schemes are requiring us to look at? Are we really taking a very broad view through a very broad lens of what is risk? What are we required to manage on a day-to-day basis? That may not be a regulatory requirement and may not even be a customer requirement, but really is necessary in order for us to protect our brand, our customers, and our consumers. And so really what an exposure quotient is on a basic scale, it's a risk assessment. And a lot of people sometimes ask, like, really, what is the intent of a risk assessment? What is it supposed to do? And so there's a definition here on the slide. I won't read the whole thing to you, but where it becomes very important is that the outcome is really to help you. It's intended for you to be able to better identify your risk and allocate resources and to be able to communicate around risk. That's the totality of risk management, or what we like to call risk engineering. It's being able to not only identify and assess your risk, but then what's the so what, now what? What are we going to do about that level of risk? Are we going to ask a high-risk supplier to do something differently than a lower-risk supplier, for example, when perhaps we're talking about a supplier risk assessment? How are we going to differentiate the assignment of resources, whether it be time, talent, treasure, with respect to the outcome of the risk assessment? And then how are we going to communicate about risk? Do we have, for example, heightened communication requirements like quarterly meetings with our high-risk suppliers to review their performance and to make sure that we're really staying on top of the risks that they may present? For example, say if a supplier is asked to institute a supply chain preventive control to help you as a manufacturer control your risk. How are we communicating about risk? How are we doing this on an ongoing basis to make sure that we're managing and mitigating and reducing it to perhaps elimination if it's possible? That's really the intent of the outcome of any kind of risk assessment, whether it be the EQ, a supplier risk assessment, or any other risk assessment you may be using in your own company. Risk assessments can be qualitative or quantitative, meaning, for example, qualitative could be using measures like low, medium, and high risk. Quantitative measures, assigning numbers, assigning rating scales, using metrics or scoring to be able to deliver an ultimate score. The EQ actually is a quantitative risk assessment that will indeed generate a score. As I mentioned before, the intent of a risk assessment is really only the start of the process of what we like to call risk engineering. Can we engineer our risk in a way that is acceptable to our organizations, that significantly reduces or perhaps eliminates our risk of whatever risk we're trying to manage? Now, on a broad scale, when you're using a risk assessment that is firing on all topics, from food fraud to food defense to social media to crisis management to complying with regulations, that's really a broad gamut of topics. But the ultimate outcome of a risk assessment is then to ask ourselves, how are we going to manage that risk? What's our risk management strategy? Again, going back to that example of if you have high, medium, and low risk suppliers, I'm hoping you're asking the high risk suppliers to do something above and beyond what you're asking of your medium and low risk suppliers. That's a risk management strategy. That's the outcome or the result of the information that you're receiving from a risk assessment. And then the question becomes, how do I monitor my risk on an ongoing basis? You'd be surprised that several companies actually miss this step. Where my word of caution comes into play here is that once you assess your risk and you create a risk management strategy, you're not done. That's not the finish line. We have to have some mechanisms in place to monitor risk on an ongoing basis. That, for example, could be periodic testing, sampling and testing of particular lots that you're receiving from a supplier. That could be self-assessments that your team conducts on a quarterly basis of a type of a risk assessment to stay on top of risk and to ensure that we're not sliding backwards, that we're not becoming complacent. Risk monitoring, can include all sorts of things, but we need to make sure that we retain a category for monitoring and we develop a monitoring program against any risk we might identify. The same can hold for complaint management, for food fraud, for food defense, as well as kind of our per se food safety plans. And then ultimately, how are we going to communicate risk? How are we going to communicate that internally to our employees, to our other partners and agents? And how will we communicate risk externally? And that's where things, programs, for example, like your recall plan, your crisis management plan. So if another type of disaster or event might happen to your company that could cause a food safety issue, how are we going to communicate and who are we going to communicate with? What's the plan? What's the process flow? Who are our external partners that we reach out to in times like that? Do we have them pre-identified? Do we have them pre-vetted as a vendor and pre-qualified as a vendor? All those things become very important when any type of crisis might might arise or incident might arise, because time becomes a very precious commodity. And having to sit down and figure out how and who you're going to communicate with and whose help you might need in order to perform that risk communication, all of that should really be captured in a recall or crisis management plan or an incident management program that your company has, so you can quickly deploy that strategy and not lose time in that type of an incident or a crisis. So why do this? Why use any form of a risk assessment or the exposure quotient risk assessment to assess your risk? What are the benefits of doing so? I think, frankly, one of the primary benefits of assessing your risk exposure is to just give you that opportunity to stop and pause and think. We are working so fast in this industry. Everything really revolves so heavily around speed to market. Remember the last conversation you had with some of your marketing colleagues, for example. There's always this perhaps healthy tension, but tension nonetheless, of speed and getting product produced and meeting customer orders, getting it distributed and out the door. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that as long as we can ensure we're doing that safely. And we're managing all the various different risks and hazards that we need to be managing on a daily basis, that we don't put those blinders back on, if you will, and are really only looking down one or two lanes of risk when we really need our peripheral vision. We really need to take those blinders off to say, what other risks am I overlooking? What am I missing? If we take the time to stop and pause and ask those very valuable questions, chances are we can always find a way to improve our programs. We can always take a step up in our continuous improvement goals and objectives when we take that time to stop, pause, think, and assess. But the primary purpose of any type of a risk assessment or the EQ tool is it's really a diagnostic tool. It's really to help you put all those various risks in one place and ask yourself to identify, is that a risk for me? Is that a risk for me in my facility? Or is that a risk for me on a corporate scale? Maybe I only have a particular risk in one facility and not my 16 other facilities. Perhaps what this tool can do is diagnose a thematic type of risk, if you will. So let's say that you run your corporate food safety program and you do have 17 facilities, and all 17 take this type of a risk assessment that's really trying to get at the heart of the matter of, are you really looking at the totality of all the risks coming at us every day? If we see that 14 out of 17 facilities have the same risk, it's a different story than if one of 17 have the same risk. It helps you understand that you do probably need to put resources there, perhaps develop a training program and deploy a training program, and ultimately help you focus your resources. Resources meaning your time, your talent, which is your people, and dollars and cents. So what are the types of factors that could impact your exposure quotient? We're going to take a look at some of them in this next section. I think the obvious come to mind with respect to regulatory compliance and legal risks. Legal risks, some of those being the very obvious things that we see through media announcements, for example, and coverage that competitors are suing each other. There's the National Advertising Division of the Better Business Bureau. It's a great venue for that, and sometimes it's very warranted. But it's also being used more and more within the competitive market. Class actions by plaintiffs' attorneys. We read about those a lot, particularly in association with these foodborne illness outbreaks that are impacting several people. consumer advocacy groups. They're not only suing manufacturers, they're suing the government. They're suing FDA. They're really, we're in an era right now where we have such an educated consumer that is demanding more and more information, that if we're not willing to provide it and capable of providing it, or providing the information they don't want to hear, they are mobilizing and they are taking action. And we've also heard a lot about the Department of Justice and how they team up with FDA. Not only FDA, but USDA. Just for example, recently a company in Chicago, it's a meat company, was enjoined because they continued to use the mark of inspection without authorization. They continued to ship products that didn't undergo inspection, in other words. And the DOJ finally basically enjoined them and permanently prohibited them from operating. The owner of this company signed that agreement to agree to stop production and not re-engage in order to avoid further criminal and civil charges. So I think a lot of times the DOJ gets a little bit of a bad rap because they look like they're coming in as a heavy hammer, if you will. And in this case, I think this helps our industry. I think that when you have a continual bad actor who isn't willing to do the right thing, that's the place of an entity like the Department of Justice. That's the place of FDA giving 483s and warning letters and referring those types of matters to the Department of Justice. So while sometimes I think we talk about this topic in a sense of the Department of Justice and FDA being kind of our foe to be feared, in this case, I really view it as them being our friends, because if they help the food industry weed out the really bad actors, we're left, the good guys basically are left to better self-regulate ourselves. So yes, we have regulations we have to meet, but I think that we all probably, if we could all vocalize this over this webinar, would agree that we build our programs beyond minimum regulatory compliance. We build them to a higher bar or a higher threshold. And in a way, that's a form of self-industry regulation, is expecting more from each other than what the minimum floor requires. We also have a corollary regulatory compliance risk. There's a lot of new rules out there. Particularly for FDA-regulated facilities at this time with the various FSMA rules. And we've got a whole different FDA, with respect to their inspection philosophy and their outlook. Their titles are changing to investigators, which sort of conveys we've done something wrong so we can prove we've done something right. That really necessitates the need to make sure all of our programs are well documented. They're very well reviewed. We've showed our work. We can talk intelligently through the rationale of our hazard analysis, which is the foundation of our food safety plans. And we can explain why or why not did we elevate a hazard to a preventive control, for example. If the inspectors come in, or ergo, should I say, investigators come in, and we can't have that kind of an intelligent conversation about why we did or did not escalate a particular hazard or risk to something that may warrant a preventive control, we're probably going to have a much harder time in that inspection. The FDA investigators are probably going to be at your facility longer than they would have if you could. It could make the difference between a 2 and a 5 day inspection, for example. So really finding ways to empower your facilities and send the appropriate messages to them about how risk is being managed, how hazards are being controlled, and who is doing that. So for example, oftentimes suppliers are controlled at corporate supplier approval, verification, ongoing monitoring. And so when a facility receives an inspection and someone at the receiving dock is asked about, well, did that come in from an approved supplier? What's your supplier approval program look like and verification program look like? And they have kind of a deer in the headlights look in response to these questions. Again, inspection won't go as smoothly as if they're empowered to understand, to say, actually, we don't manage that here. Our corporate manages that, but here's where we come into play. I'm at the receiving dock door. I'm doing a verification check against what we're supposed to be receiving. Those types of conversations, to be able to differentiate who's doing what and where risks and hazards are being managed. So we not only have legal risks and regulatory compliance requirements, we also have a changing landscape of customer requirements, or what I call private standard requirements. Private standards could be GFSI certifications. It could be your customer requirements. We're seeing a lot of change in the industry by way of contracting. How can we better protect ourselves in contracts? And also, how can we better communicate to our partners what the expectations are to do business with us? So, for example, supplier agreements are becoming more robust. They're laying out supply chain control requirements more clearly than they have in the past. And these are all good things that are a result of communicating and talking about risk and then trying to memorialize it somewhere in writing that matters. And typically a contract is the best place to do that in. We're also seeing an increasing requirements around testing. So whether that be your customers are asking for increased testing from your facility prior to you shipping it to them, or you as a manufacturer asking your suppliers to perform more testing so that you can increase your confidence that what they're shipping you is clean, good, and safe and wholesome food. The fact of the matter is we're still seeing fairly high rates of recalls. We're not seeing a reduction in recalls post-FSMA like some had perhaps anticipated. And, there could be lots of reasons for that, and there are a lot of reasons for that. So one of the net results of how do I monitor and manage that risk of this continued recall phenomenon? When we dig deeper to what the cause of recalls are, the top reasons for recalls are still allergens and pathogens from our suppliers. So really taking a look at enhancing supply chain controls and supply chain requirements, and again, memorializing that somewhere in a document that someone has to sign up for and probably sign their John Hancock on to say, I've read and understand what's expected of me within the supply chain. We also have the phenomenon of changing science. I mean, one of the reasons that I believe that recalls have not reduced is because we just have an increased sensitivity in our technology to find things in our product that aren't supposed to be there. Again, that's a positive. We're increasing our ability to protect the world's food supply for the consuming public. And that is certainly a positive result from this enhanced science and from these enhanced regulations. But I think the reality of the risk check here is for example, their labs are using whole genome sequencing. So when they come in and do an inspection and they undergo what we all love the phrase of, which is the swabathon, chances are those swabs are going to be tested using whole genome sequencing. So the conversation we're having as an industry around, well, should I use it for my samples internally within my organization? It becomes a very big risk conversation. There are those who are in the camp that would say not yet. There are those who would, too much of a risk. There are those who say PFGE, sufficient to give you the information you need without going all the way to whole genome sequencing. Others are taking the bull by the horn and adopting whole genome sequencing internally. Of those that I am aware of, they are doing it under very strict and prescribed confines. For example, hiring an attorney and doing this under attorney-client privilege, trying to put up a little bit of a higher wall around the information and the ability to have to release that information and in trying to increase their ability to retain the information as proprietary, commercial, confidential company information that wouldn't be released. Notwithstanding, at the end of the day, most companies say, I'd rather know. I'd rather know, and I'd rather know ahead of the results coming back into a regulator so that I can put together an appropriate response plan and an incident management plan accordingly. Because long story short, we're not going to go backwards when it comes to technological advancements. We're going to continue to see greater capacity to link food to an illness, to a particular person, to a particular production facility. And we need to continue to have the conversation of how can we do that as an industry and test for that in a very efficient and sensitive way without tripping too many liability triggers, if you will. And that conversation is being had between industry and, for example, FDA at this time to try to come to some sort of a determination of, how can we do this without too much risk being brought to bear. As I mentioned, the FDA is conducting their first FSMA inspections around the preventive controls rules, as well as some folks are already experiencing the foreign supplier verification program inspections as well. So what are we seeing? I think the number one theme or learning from these first inspections is that FDA is really looking closely at allergen controls. If you are producing food that has an allergen in it, it's really taking a really hard, close look at your hazard analysis to say, are you doing everything you can to control the risk of undeclared allergen labeling and or allergen cross-contact? So they're looking at things like sanitation to ensure that allergen cross-contact isn't happening, say, for example, on a food contact surface at changeover. So understanding kind of the marriage between allergen preventive controls, sanitation preventive controls, how they pair together, where we're putting the allergen controls in place. Do we do it at the front end of label verification when the packaging comes in, as well as the back end after we produce food and put it in that package? Or do we just do it at the end? So we've already produced the food. It's already, we've got a lot more loss associated with that if there is a mistake to be made. We're also learning that corrective actions are extremely important. FDA continues to focus on them. We'll ask for examples of corrective actions when they come in for an inspection, and they really need to have a closed loop process associated with them. They need to be complete, both for the product and the process. And one of the learnings that a lot of these companies who have undergone these first inspections is that we need to have a mechanism to be able to quickly communicate with our other production facilities what we learned at this production facility that underwent the FSMA PC inspection. First of all, it's important just so that we've got consistency and harmonization to the extent that that makes sense if they're making the same or similar products. But also, if the regulators come into a second and a third plant and they see the same themes of deviations and noncompliances, they're going to really start to question the training and the overall foundation of the program itself that kind of trickles up back to the corporate guidance, if you will. So it's really important to have a way, whether it's weekly calls or monthly calls that you have with your plants, and speed that up if you're learning some pivotal and critical things during these inspections. Also, FDA is referencing the draft guidance, the hazard analysis guidance, and while FDA guidance is not binding, this is happening. This is a phenomenon, and so being able to have the conversation of why did you not identify a hazard that may or may not cause a food safety risk that happens to be listed in the FDA draft guidance in association with the type of food you produce. You're going to need to be able to have that conversation and or make sure that you're referencing the draft guidance. and perhaps cite it in your food safety plan. Even if you don't believe that a particular hazard warrants a preventive control or warrants analysis, document it. Have that in your justification so that not only you, but anyone who comes after you in your position, or if you're out on vacation, for example, the day of your inspection, they can also speak intelligently about why or why not they identified a hazard that requires a preventive control, or why they didn't think that this particular hazard warranted a preventive control. And one of the things that are really helping organizations right now, and that FDA is really recognizing is an extreme help, is having policies, having what we call regulatory inspection guidelines. How are we going to handle when FDA asks to take photos? How will we handle when they come in to do the swabathons and take a lot of swabs? Are we going to do duplicate swabs and test? Are we going to take duplicate swabs and hold them pending FDA's results? Are we not taking duplicate swabs at all? There's no right or wrong answer, but documenting what the protocol and the policy is for everyone's benefit, so that when tensions are high, when the inspection's going on, everybody knows what playbook to play by. That includes whether or not your company is willing to sign an FDA 483 or a USDA NR, for example, and or if you have a policy where all of those have to be escalated to your corporate counsel prior to signing, or that perhaps you just don't sign them, all of which I've seen with respect to these types of policy guidelines. We also have a whole realm of business risks that really need to be incorporated into any kind of risk assessment you might be using, and are incorporated in the EQ risk assessment. Everything from how the supply chain impacts us and how we're managing that, from initial supplier approval and verification to ongoing monitoring of the performance of those suppliers. How many of our suppliers are sole source? That alone can be a risk if that sole source supplier goes out of business for any reason. We have other risks associated that are kind of quasi-business risks, kind of quasi-regulatory risks. But folks, some companies are just simply behind the 8 ball when it comes to developing and implementing their food safety plans. That's not only a regulatory risk, but I think it's really a business risk, because what this food safety plan does is it helps you to start to broaden your lens and look at risk. What FSMA did was to add some additional types of hazards that they asked us to really take a good close look at. For example, sanitation and allergen control and supply chain control. By doing so, all of this helps you protect your brand and your brand reputation and your business. And it can create some operational efficiencies in your productions as well. So we're losing out on some opportunities when we're not undergoing an assessment like this and getting our appropriate food safety plans in place and firing on all cylinders. We have other types of internal types of business risks as well that we need to understand. Are we lacking in having our process controls validated? Do we need our process preventive controls revalidated? Have we made a change recently? It's staying on top of asking those types of real-time questions to identify, do I have a risk? Do I have a risk now? You may take a risk assessment like this today and get 1 score. You would take it again next month and get a different score, because risks are relative and risks are constantly changing. So you may have a different mix of risks a month from now as you do now, or 6 months from now as you do now. But notwithstanding, if we can keep going back to a list of all the various different types of hazards and risks we're asked to manage as food safety and quality professionals, it helps keep us fresh, and it helps reduce our risk of complacency and kind of putting those blinders on, if you will. We have a whole host of brand and reputation risks too. Some of them I've talked about already. Is what is our position on the use of social media when we have an outbreak or a recall or a market action? How do we monitor complaints in social media? How does that integrate with our complaint management strategy, if at all? And P.S. it should. Where are we on our journey of food safety culture? Because frankly, if it's weak, we have a brand and a business risk, and perhaps a regulatory risk as well. How does our new product development process bring to the table our food safety and quality professionals? Does it do so in the 11th hour, and that's why they're always looked at as the bad guys and the cops? Or are they brought in early and often to be able to assess risk and hazards, to say, you know what, this new formulation with this new ingredient is going to jack up our risk exponentially. Can we formulate this product without this new ingredient? Because we can manage our risk better, or can we produce it in facility X instead of facility Y because facility X already handles that allergen? Otherwise, we're going to introduce a new allergen in facility Y, and they're going to have to completely redo and relook at their food safety plan because now they're introducing a new hazard. It's those kinds of questions that become so valuable in that R&D new product development process. You know, if we miss a beat, we have the risk of recalls. We have the risk of adverse regulatory relationships. The USDA or the FDA looking at us, not really giving us the benefit of the doubt as we go forward. We have a clear risk of customer and consumer loyalty and trust dissipating, and consumers not returning to our product, to the point where perhaps at times the issue is so big, the recall or the outbreak is so big, we might have to actually kill a brand and kill a product, either relaunching it under another brand name, which takes a lot more money and time than you think, and or permanently retiring that particular product. What the results of this type of risk assessment can do for us is help us reduce and engineer away a lot of these types of risks we just talked about. And also what it can do is really just give us a glimpse of where do we need some customized solutions? Where do we need some customized risk management and a risk monitoring and a risk communication focus with respect to our programs? Maybe you get to the end of a risk assessment that's this robust, that's asking questions about your environmental monitoring program and testing, finished product testing if you're conducting that at all. How do you identify emerging risks? Who does that? Who's responsible for that? Is anyone? Do you have a recall and crisis management plan that is broad enough to account for things like what happens if there's a fire or a tornado that impacts products? What about business continuity? What are your top 5 or 10 selling SKUs? Where are they produced? If that facility goes down for any reason, then who has capacity? You know, where else can you get those top selling SKUs produced? Do you have internal capacity? Do you need to go to a co-manufacturer? These are the types of things that this type of assessment can elicit and the conversations that can be elicited. Do you need to do more testing? Is your environmental monitoring program robust for the risk, the type of product, the type of ingredients, the size of your facility, the number of people who work there, the type of sanitation you conduct, how often you conduct sanitation? All of those things really play into where your EMP program should be firing on. Here's an example of just one question or sub-question actually out of the EQ risk assessment. So just to call out a couple of points, this EQ risk assessment is meant for dual regulated facilities, so USDA and or FDA, or if you're regulated by both in the same facility, it will apply to you. Because again, we're asking questions around risk in its kind of highest level, if you will. So this one gets rather specific because if you answered yes to an earlier question that you are FDA jurisdiction only, then you have some additional questions to answer. If you were USDA only and had selected that, you would not see this question. So that's kind of how dynamic this risk assessment is and how applicable it can be to you, your company, your regulatory authority, and your facility. So in this question, for example, we're asking, do you have a PCQI on site at your facility? And the answers came back in as either I'm not sure what a PCQI is, or we have an outside consultant to perform. So these answers really try to elicit the breadth of potential responses that folks could have. Someone taking this assessment may not know what a PCQI is. Maybe they just haven't gotten the memo yet. Maybe it's somebody taking this assessment who's in finance, and really it starts to call out the fact that they should bring a team in to answer these types of questions to better understand the totality of their risk. It also recognizes that we can use outside consultants. So it's not just simple yes or no's. There are very tailored responses that are possible in this type of risk assessment. So if you're using your own risk assessment, we would encourage you to build that kind of strategy and format in it as well. But ultimately, the results are meant to diagnose areas of risk, potential threat to your organization, potential threat to your consumers and your customers, and to be able to then focus on those most critical, highest level risks and really put your concentrated time, talent, and treasure in that high risk category. And really what this does is it gives you so much objectivity, because otherwise, oftentimes we're going to our C-suites to ask for CapEx without a lot of data behind us and without a lot of substantiation in that conversation to say, I need X amount of dollars and this is why, and here's the level of relative risk associated with it if we don't put some risk controls and risk mitigations in place. Because otherwise, this simple little quippet here is probably pretty true in our organizations, which is, there's only one pot of gold. There's only so much money. And oftentimes it feels like we're robbing Peter to pay Paul. And we're if you're not getting the CapEx, then maybe somebody else did in another department. But we're never going to get the support of our C-suite if we don't have actionable information and data to support our request. And that's the kind of communication and conversation we need to start having. And so that's the intent of using a tool like this that can quantify your risk and help give you some visuals to say, here, this is why I need the CapEx. And another little cartoon, if you will, about robbing Peter to pay Paul, but you never mentioned Mary. Well, in our space, there is a lot of conversation about Mary. Her name's Mary Wilkerson. She was that quality manager at Peanut Corporation of America. She's serving 5 years for one count of obstruction of justice because she didn't tell the truth about some testing results and shipping products based upon those results. 5 years. She appealed her conviction and the courts wouldn't take up her appeal. She actually lost the first appeal and the courts wouldn't take up any further appeals on her or the Parnell brothers who ran Peanut Corporation of America. But what this type of a risk assessment can help us do and understand is, what are all of the various different risks I'm supposed to be paying attention to on a daily basis? Because somebody like Mary, who was promoted from a secretary or an administrative assistant to a food safety and quality professional, if we really dug down and assessed that risk prior to that happening, perhaps maybe it would have revealed she didn't have all the training she needed. Maybe she didn't have all of the qualifications she needed. We can all speculate, but notwithstanding, it's staying one step ahead of risk so it doesn't come back to bite us. And doing it on an ongoing basis, so again, that we don't fall complacent and we don't slip backwards. So this is how an exposure quotient can fit into your risk mitigation, your risk engineering, your enterprise risk management strategy, whatever you're calling it in your organization. Assessment's only the first step. This helps you assess the risk and identify the risk so that you can put a risk management plan in place to close the gap, to then be able to maintain and monitor that on an ongoing basis and then be able to communicate about risk and the risks that are most important to your organization or where you're most at risk. So lastly, hopefully this gives you a little bit of a glimpse into what an exposure quotient is. It's really meant to identify and measure on a relative scale your organizational intelligence and where you're at with the multiple different topics and programs and issues and risks that we're supposed to manage, and understand where your risks are, both internally and externally in your supply chain. It will then help you drive the so what, now what, the what comes next, and that's your risk management strategy. But we also encourage you to continue to utilize a tool like this on an ongoing basis so that you make sure you're not slipping backwards. There really, truly is a return on investment to knowing your exposure and knowing your risk exposure, however you accomplish that. Whether you're doing that through self-assessments, through internal audits, through your annual GFSI certifications, and a combination of all of that, or a tool like this, it's just keeping the blinders off. It's keeping that peripheral vision out there, looking for all the various risks we're supposed to be managing today, but not only today, but tomorrow's risks. How are we spotting emerging risks? How are we managing emerging risks? Is anybody tasked to be looking for that? Where are we on our journey of our food safety culture? Everyone has one. The question is how strong or weak it is, or how mature or weak it is. And in a very mature food safety culture, there are people whose eyes are on those emerging risks and monitoring for the next melamine, for example. But ultimately, it's important to recognize that you're never done. This is a journey. This is not a destination. When you finished writing your food safety plan, you were not done. You were just starting because you have all of the monitoring, all the verification, all the corrective actions associated with maintaining that plan. This type of risk assessment, yes, it can absolutely be a useful tool to help you identify your risks and understand where to allocate your resources, but you're not done. Continue to use it. Continue to use a tool like this to be able to understand, did you nip that risk in the bud, and is that no longer a risk? Or is that continual risk year after year in your organization that we're really just not paying adequate attention to? So if we remember that food safety is a journey, not a destination, I think that's probably the biggest nugget I would leave you with, is something to understand the totality of your risks, not only internally, but externally in your supply chain. Brian, I'm going to give it back to you.
All right. Well, thank you. You tackled a big topic and you got it in there. I really appreciate it. In fact, this is so much about why we called it Beyond Compliance. I think if you know Melanie, and as I've gotten to know you, what we really appreciate about you is you're very passionate, not just about checking the boxes, but about just becoming better as an industry. So I think that shown through here. In the interest of time, we do want to make sure we get to some of the questions. And I think, Melanie, what I'm going to do is maybe ask you one or two to summarize. And then I think you've been kind enough to offer to take any offline. So I've got up on the screen here some different ways you can reach her, including text, which I'm very impressed with. But you covered a lot of area, a lot of things to consider as you kind of expand the scope of what you consider for risk. If we were just sitting around a table right now and someone said, hey, we've kind of got our food safety plan, we're thinking about these, but like you said, it's really about actually sitting down and executing it. What advice do you give for someone who really wants to get started with something like this? How does it roll into their overall food safety management plan or system?
And that's a great question, Brian. And really, this is a form of enterprise risk management. This is something that would resonate with your C-suite, in my honest opinion. I do think that it is a very robust and holistic tool that you can integrate into your food safety management system to better assess and understand, is my program complete? How holistic and how robust, really is it? Do I have any gaps? And that's really the intent and some of the intents of this type of tool and this type of an assessment. I think when you go about actually tackling it, to do it in a cross-functional team effort, those who are responsible for supply chain, for procurement, for warehousing and storage, for shipping and receiving, as well as the mainstream food safety production and operations. Those are the types of folks that would weigh in very beneficially on an assessment like this.
That's such a great point, that it doesn't, we feel so much for our audience. We're very passionate about supporting them. And it does feel like sometimes this all lands on their shoulders. So I think that's really great advice, that you've got to get buy-in, but you also got to get participation from other people in the organization. I think we forget that sometimes. So well said.
Absolutely. If we can avoid being an island unto ourselves, we will sleep better at night and probably have a more robust view of our risks versus just the lens that we bring to the table.
No, such a great point. I appreciate that. And thank you for all the stuff. And as I said in the beginning, Melanie's been kind enough to allow us to share the deck. So the deck can almost serve as a checklist, but we certainly encourage you to reach out. She's also got a ton of great resources here, including her newsletter, as well as their site over at Matrix Sciences. So connect with her there. We'll also include her contact info when we follow up with all of you. Also want to encourage you, if you are like this content, you need some more, we've got other recorded webinars and videos. We've got a lot of great content, including this webinar will be produced into a written piece if you prefer to share it that way with your colleagues. And as I mentioned, we'll also be sharing this out via a recording link in the next coming days. And if you have some questions about how we might be able to help, how do we fit into executing something like this or supporting your plan around risk assessments, we certainly would love a chance to chat with you as well. And you can reach us again at our website, safetychain.com. So with that, we want to get everybody out on time. And for those questions we didn't get to, Melanie and her team will follow up with you directly. I want to thank all of you for making time again in your busy schedules to be here. We hope you found this valuable and hope you'll join us again next month. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.